I okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. And I want to also thank the people for dialing in and listening in and participating. So I will be talking on behalf of the Evidence-Based Toxicology Collaboration. The Johns Hopkins University Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing, or CAT, runs the secretariat for that organization, the EBT collaboration. And so that's one reason why I'm speaking to you today on behalf of the collaboration. So I'm not necessarily speaking word for the collaboration. We didn't run the slides by every member, but we're working together to try to make evidence-based toxicology a reality. We're excited about the possibilities, but it's very much work in progress. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Start out with evidence-based medicine and the Cochrane collaboration, then talk about evidence-based toxicology and the EBT collaboration, the challenges and opportunities for EBT, say a few words about a workshop that we held. Let me see. Okay. And also going to talk about next steps. So let me begin by talking about evidence-based medicine and the Cochrane collaboration. So those are our inspirations. Many of you probably are somewhat familiar with the field of evidence-based medicine. It's typically defined in the way you see on the slide, the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. So it's very much clinically, medically oriented. And then you have the Cochrane collaboration, which is all about systematic reviews of the effects of healthcare interventions, which is the pivot point for evidence-based medicine, marshaling the evidence. So how does one go about practicing evidence-based medicine? It's basically a 5-point process, beginning with formulating the question you see at the top, gathering the evidence, appraising the evidence, then integrating the evidence. And that integration is a mixture of the evidence that's put forward with clinical expertise and the value of the patients that one is treating. And then finally, one evaluates the process to see how well it worked and whether you can do things differently next time around. So I'll be talking about gathering and appraising the evidence. I just want to underscore that each of these steps is very highly formalized and explicit. So gathering and appraising the evidence, again, the cornerstone there are systematic reviews. And here are the key elements of systematic reviews: a search strategy, selection criteria for what studies one decides to include within the analysis or exclude, how one goes about appraising the data that are included, and then possibly a meta-analysis looking at the quantitative compilation of their findings from previous studies. And all that is done in a spirit of, as you can see on the left-hand side, openness, transparency, and continuous improvement. So a few more words about data appraisal. And here I've taken an example from a recent publication in the Cochrane database of systematic reviews by Blakely et al., cold water immersion or cryotherapy for preventing and treating muscle soreness after exercise. So the details are not important here, but once a determination has been made to include studies in the systematic review, there's also a determination as to the risk of bias of the individual studies that are included. So it may be a little hard to see going down the left side of the figure, the sources of bias, but these are the standard things in clinical studies, so blinding of participants, blinding of the personnel conducting the study, random allocation, etc. So on the right-hand side, you see an indication of the percentage of studies that have what was judged as low risk of bias, unclear risk of bias, or high risk of bias. So one typically stands back and looks at the overall level of bias in the studies that were conducted to get a general feel for how robust the conclusions are likely to be. There are also data interpretation tools. So from the same study by Blakely et al., I want to call your attention to this center piece, which is called a forest plot. And so for each of the studies that was reviewed in the Blakely et al. Systematic review, there's an estimate of the mean and standard deviation of the critical comparison. The center line here is sort of, that's the line of identical effect between the cryoimmersion versus, in this case, what they called a passive treatment. Whereas if a lot of these lines, a lot of these green dots that you see, if they were on the left of the center line, that would favor cryotherapy, indicate that cryotherapy was better than the passive treatment, and the reverse would be the case if the points fell on the right-hand side of the line. And here, right on the line, is the overall total for this group of studies, and which you can see is right on the line. So there's very little evidence here of any effect of cold water immersion over what's called passive therapy. So these are just tools for how to interpret the data. And this forest plot is echoed in the logo of the Cochrane collaboration. You see this center part is essentially a forest plot that explains their logo. So a few words about the Cochrane collaboration itself. It prepares, maintains, and promotes the accessibility of systematic reviews on the effects of healthcare interventions. Interventions is the word they use. It's not only therapies, but any sort of clinically relevant tool like a diagnostic procedure, prognostic procedure, etc. The collaboration was launched about 20 years ago. The U.S. Center is right here at Johns Hopkins University, and it's been incredibly successful. And last year they had over 28,000 active contributors, as you can see, spread all over the globe, with several thousand systematic reviews published online in the Cochrane Library and updated regularly. So it's a tremendously successful organization. Here's a screenshot of the homepage of the Cochrane Library. Anybody could go on and retrieve information about a systematic review. The abstracts are free, available to anyone. The text of the studies themselves, I think one needs a subscription, and many institutions do have subscriptions. So I highly recommend that you look at that. Some criticisms of evidence-based approaches that one hears, these usually fall into two camps. One is, hey, don't bother me. I practice the art of medicine. I don't need all these statistically based, rigorous approaches. And there, the critics are essentially saying, look, I trust my own clinical expertise, and they're devaluing the notion of going after the best external evidence. And then the other criticism that one hears is all science is evidence-based. Why are we terming this evidence-based medicine? So this is a criticism of terminology rather than the approach, and perhaps way back when evidence-based medicine should have come up with a different name, but they didn't. This one seems to fit, and the approach seems to be widely appreciated these days. The importance of an evidence-based approach. This is a slide from my colleague Ellen Silbergeld here at Hopkins, and I put it up primarily for her third bullet, but you can see sort of obvious reasons for wanting to have an evidence-based approach, increasing the transparency of decision-making, et cetera. But in her third bullet, she says stimulating innovation in methods and more relevant research. So many people think of evidence-based medicine as simply a retrospective exercise where you look at the available data and draw conclusions, whereas what Ellen and others are pointing to is that there can be a feedback loop such that the evidence-based approaches can lead others to develop better studies with less risk of bias. So some other indications of the importance of an evidence-based approach are listed there. I want to move on to talking about evidence-based toxicology and the EBT collaboration per se. I've spent some time on evidence-based medicine because not everybody is familiar with that, and it was an obvious point of confusion at a recent workshop we held. So I think it was worth spending some time on that. So the potential applications of evidence-based medicine to evidence-based toxicology. Some are rather straightforward. Often in evidence-based medicine, one is looking at causation or harm. So years ago, a key question was, does smoking cause lung cancer, for example? And that would translate quite readily to toxicology and looking at the harmful effects of chemicals, either in the human health arena or the environmental health arena. And another parallel area between evidence-based medicine and toxicology is in diagnosis and diagnostic test assessment, where the toxicity parallel is test method assessment, whether you're looking at new methods or existing methods or indeed test strategies. And we'll look at these areas in a bit. But I don't want to minimize the importance of the overarching principles of evidence-based medicine being objective, transparent, and systematic, and the importance of applying those to toxicology. There have been some pioneering efforts in evidence-based toxicology, typically in the area of harm. Here's one, again, by my colleague Ellen Silbergeld, a systematic review of lead and blood pressure. And again, just two side-by-side forest plots looking at diastolic and systolic blood pressure with individual studies in rows, again, measures of central tendency and spread. And the details are not important here, but at the base of each forest plot, Ellen has indicated the overall mean, and you can see there's some a slight effect just off the zero line, but not a tremendous effect. Again, so these are tools for decision making. The area of test method assessment as opposed to harm, I think we're all familiar with sort of 2x2 tables, looking at how well a test predicted the inherent hazards of a chemical, and the standard notions of test method performance, of sensitivity, specificity, also looking at things like a positive predictive value, negative predictive value, and these last two measures are heavily influenced by the prevalence of harmful chemicals in the environment. And so one of the values of an evidence-based approach in toxicology is looking at the impact of prevalence on the results that one gets, which has implications for large-scale testing programs. It has implications for looking at all kinds of things. So prevalence is very important. So on to the evidence-based toxicology collaboration. So who is that? We have a steering committee in the United States. You could see the folks on the committee listed there with their affiliations for identification purposes only. And we have a counterpart group in Europe that's just getting underway. And CAT is the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing is the secretariat for both steering committees. What are our aims? Again, paralleling evidence-based medicine to promote the gathering and appraising of the available data to address toxicological questions so that decisions are based on the best available evidence. And following the point that I showed on a slide by Ellen Silbergeld earlier, to have a prospective element to what we do to provide guidance that can be used prospectively to generate unbiased evidence for such decision making, and to do all this in a systematic, objective, and transparent manner. And more specifically, we'll be looking at the assessment of test methods and their performance and quality assurance. Of course, we'll be using the full array of tools from evidence-based medicine, and where necessary, adapting those to the field of toxicology. And we'll also be using those tools to look at how one goes about developing effective tests and testing strategies, as well as how to synthesize data across studies to facilitate robust decision making. We're in an era now where there'll be diverse data streams on a given chemical, and how one combines these to come up with an overall conclusion will be a challenge. A few additional defining characteristics of evidence-based toxicology. These are taken from the proceedings of the first International Forum towards Evidence-Based Toxicology. That was published a couple of years ago, and it took place, I think, in 2005 or 7. We'll see in a minute on a timeline. So additional characteristics: the willingness to check assumptions on which current practice is based. Again, the spirit is continuous improvement. Acknowledging that we need new and improved tools for critical evaluation and the quantitative integration of scientific evidence. So it's not simply a matter of taking tools off the shelf from evidence-based medicine. It embraces all aspects of toxicological practice and all types of evidence. No type of evidence is excluded. And includes all branches of toxicological science, including environmental and eco and clinical, as well as human health assessment. So here's the timeline that I alluded to earlier. So, and you see the years arrayed along the left from 2005 up to the present. And there have been several articles on evidence-based toxicology that have been published over the years. Phil Ghazalian, my colleagues, Thomas Hartung, Sebastian Hoffman, primarily, and as well as several meetings. So that first international forum that I mentioned a minute ago, that took place in 2007, and then more recently a series of meetings in 2010, 11, and 12. And it was at the meeting in 2010, you see 21st Century Validation for our 21st Century Tools, where the collaboration essentially got started, and we focused in on the issue of validation. And you see the quote here: existing validation approaches could not meet the needs of tests based on the new technologies. So at least initially, if not to this day, we remain very much interested in applying evidence-based approaches to the validation of new methods. And that you see here, one of our priorities is the quality assurance of the new test methods. So what are our overarching plans? One was to hold a kickoff meeting to state the concept of evidence-based toxicology and identify the issues involved. And that essentially was our meeting last year at the Society of Toxicology meeting. So we've done that. We wanted to hold a follow-up workshop to develop substantive and organizational priorities. And that essentially was the meeting that we just held in Research Triangle Park that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. We want to then establish working groups to address the priorities that were identified in the recent workshop. We want to develop an organizational structure and operational procedures as appropriate. And we want to engage people who are interested in this to help participate in the process. Because like the Cochrane collaboration, the evidence-based toxicology collaboration will largely be a volunteer exercise of interested stakeholders. So I want to move on to talk about some challenges and opportunities for EBT. There are any number of opportunities in the form of drivers for critical reappraisals in toxicology. I think we're all aware of being at the threshold for a paradigm shift in toxicology, as exemplified here by the robots at the NIH Chemical Genomics Center, pathway-based approaches. Political drivers such as the cosmetic directive in Europe calling for a ban on certain tests for cosmetic purposes and leading to a push towards developing new procedures. Various large-scale testing programs such as REACH and the High Production Volume Chemical Challenge Program, which all include mandates to collect available evidence on chemicals and come to some conclusion about the overall impact of those chemicals, the toxicological profile, and that can be done with evidence-based approaches. There's obviously a nexus between EBT and the 3 Rs or alternative approaches. Quality assurance through EBT can pave the way for new methods to be used, and also critical evaluation of existing methods, which are mostly animal-based, can document their limitations and open up the door to their replacement. Some challenges in applying the evidence-based approaches to validation. There's the overarching question of whether existing validation approaches are fit for purpose for toxicity testing in the 21st century. We've developed those approaches for other purposes, and now we have to see whether they fit for mechanism of action-based or pathway-based methods. Are there enough studies by which to judge the performance of the new methods? New methods, by definition, are new, and there may not be much in the way of data, and evidence-based methods are primarily about sifting through the available data. So this is a challenge. What is the reference standard for the new toxicology, and how good is it as we try to transition from animal-based to human-based toxicology? What is the availability of negative data or proprietary data? So here you get into bias in the publication database because certain studies are not in there, and that is a challenge to evidence-based approaches. And are existing good laboratory practice guidances applicable to high-throughput systems and their laboratories? And finally, how to evaluate evidence across data streams, which I alluded to earlier in synthesizing different types of data across levels of biological organization. Clearly a challenge in the new toxicology. So approaches to assessing data quality in toxicology, there have been a number of starts at this. Many of you are familiar with the Clemish scores. reliable without restrictions, reliable with restrictions, etc., an early attempt to appraise the data that one is compiling and reviewing. And more recently, there's been an attempt to systematize the Clemish scores and see how repeatable they are. And this was a recent study by Snyder et al. And they developed the ToxR tool, which is available on the ECVAM website. I mentioned the recent workshop in Research Triangle Park, and spent a little time going over some of the highlights from that. So that was evidence-based toxicology for the 21st century, opportunities and challenges, and you see the sponsors along the bottom there. And just to give you a snapshot of the program, it was divided into 4 sessions that you see across the top row: pathway validation, case studies, EBTC, priorities. What would the priorities of the collaboration be, and what should our governance structure look like? So the pathway validation session was teed up by Richard Judson from EPA, and each of the sessions had 1 or more white papers, and then invited discussants to comment on the paper. So Richard Judson gave us his thoughts on initial thoughts on how one might go about validating the pathway-based high-throughput systems. And in the case study session, there were essentially 3 white papers or case studies. Ellen Silbergeld talked about some of her early work looking at causation or harm of chemicals and giving us the benefit of her experience and current thoughts on what an evidence-based toxicology would look like. Dahlen Juberg from Dow talked about a HESI project on looking at how one distinguishes adversity from adaptation in these pathway-based assays, which is a fundamental pillar to establishing the quality assurance of these new pathway-based approaches. Patricia Harlow spoke about something similar in that she looked at how one qualifies biomarkers in various drug studies to pass muster at the Food and Drug Administration. So essentially, how one convinces FDA that they are monitoring a biomarker that adequately captures a pathway-based system. And thirdly, in the priorities session, Susie Fitzpatrick from FDA gave us her thoughts, which were centered largely around the validation question, but she also gave us a nice sense of the different regulatory mandates amongst the various agencies. And fourthly, Jack Fowle, retired from EPA, gave an extensive presentation on various role models that the EBT collaboration might wish to follow in setting up its own organization and rules of procedures. And Jack centered very much on the Cochrane collaboration as an organizational role model. So there isn't time on this presentation today to go into much detail about what each of these presenters and commenters said and what came up in Q&A, but I wanted to go through a few slides of cross-cutting issues that came up. And I think most of us, if not everyone, came away with a strong sense of EBT's potential value. At the same time, there were also publications that we need to work on reaching a common understanding of what EBT is and what it isn't. And so a strong recommendation that came out of the workshop was to put on something like an EBT 101, an introduction to evidence-based medicine and the emerging discipline of evidence-based toxicology. So look for that in the near future. And clearly the need to move from talking about evidence-based toxicology to actually begin practicing it. And here there was a strong recommendation for doing a pilot study that can serve as a concrete illustration of what we have in mind and how to go about doing it. A second set of cross-cutting issues had to do with the collaboration scope. Will it be an analytical organization or an advocacy organization? And here across the bottom is sort of the sequence of events that one goes through in evidence-based medicine, from sort of generating the evidence to gathering and assessing it to integrating the evidence with policy, et cetera. And it was pointed out that the evidence-based toxicology, or rather the Cochrane collaboration, very much focuses on gathering and assessing evidence, and they leave it to others to integrate that evidence into clinical practice or government policy, et cetera. And so there was a recommendation that we as the evidence-based toxicology collaboration not spill over into advocacy, but leave that to others. The importance and the challenge of transparency was a recurrent theme that and this presents particular challenges in the realm of toxicology with issues of proprietary data, confidential business information, regulatory concerns, et cetera, lack of publication of data, and the importance of coordination between the steering committees in the United States and in Europe. And one other slide on cross-cutting issues, the question that came up a number of times was, can EBT provide quality assurance guidance to prospectively help develop the new toxicology? So not only retrospectively assess data, but prospectively give guidance for how one might go about doing good studies, et cetera. And so this again is related to this this figure I put up earlier of the sequence of steps that one moves through as one goes through the evidence-based medicine or toxicology process. And that's the primary direction of how knowledge flows. But as Ellen and other commenters mentioned at the workshop, there are also feedback loops in all this, so that learnings from subsequent steps can feed back to earlier steps and indeed back to how one goes about generating evidence. And given the focus, the importance that we've put on the validation question, I just wanted to put in one slide with a few highlights on that session alone. So this was Richard Judson's session. And clearly the underlying notion was the need to expand the validation toolbox beyond where it is today to handle tools for 21st century toxicology. Validation is still what it is and has been, the relevance and reliability of a test for a specific purpose. But when we're talking about high throughput systems, and especially in the realm of prioritization, which is what ToxCast is all about, Richard and others thought that that relevance will be the key challenge, that reliability will be a little easier to establish, and besides, there aren't going to be a tremendous number of labs initially set up with these costly robots to carry out these studies. So that was the workshop. Some next steps. Obviously, we need to take stock of all the input that we got from the workshop. There was an incredible amount of food for thought, and start establishing working groups to address what will be our priorities, both substantive priorities and analytical priorities that will help us with the tools for evidence-based analyses. We need to develop an organizational structure and operational procedures as appropriate, and engage stakeholders to participate in the process, so we build up a larger scale collaborative effort. And in addition, we'll be publishing the proceedings of the workshop in Altex. We will be holding a satellite meeting at the Society of Toxicology meeting in San Francisco in a few weeks, and that satellite meeting will include evidence-based toxicology. It'll be the Sunday of the SOT meeting. Look for that. It'll be an open forum on updates on the new toxicology and evidence-based toxicology. The European evidence-based toxicology collaboration will launch in June. You see the information there. Those of you who've dialed in from Europe may be interested in participating in that. So the European collaboration is just a little bit behind where the U.S. one is at the moment, but is likely to catch up very shortly. And finally, EBT and you, if you're interested in these kinds of approaches and want to get involved or at least receive updates, let me know. There is a lot of excitement about the potential for evidence-based approaches in toxicology. We're serious now about moving forward after a few false starts in the past on this, and we're going to see how far we can take this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty, for the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, please. Thanks to our helpful computer voice there. So go ahead and speak up if you have questions. And,
Christy, can I just make a suggestion?
Sure.
I noticed on my screen some of the people on the call, and there are a number of people from the Evidence-Based Toxicology Collaboration Steering Committee, and I'm wondering if we could take a minute or two to see if any one of those folks wants to add anything or correct any misstatement I may have made or whatever.
Sure.
No, this is Alan Goldberg. Marty, I think you did a really nice job of presenting both a little bit of the history and the real thinking behind evidence-based toxicology.
I'll for it for you.
This is Thomas Harder and can only join the choir. It was really a great job. Thanks.
Okay, great.
General comment?
Yeah.
Questions, comments?
Hi, Marty. This is Sherry.
Yeah. Hi, Sherry.
Hi. I tried to type in my question on the chat online, but it didn't seem to be working. I was just wondering, it seems like the evidence-based toxicology is another statistics-based approach, and you're talking about using it for looking at ways to use it for validating test methods, which is currently one of the main problems with that is, to me, seems to be its strong emphasis on statistic-based approach for judging new methods. So how do you see the evidence-based toxicology being used to assess these very highly mechanistic-based pathways that you're going to be looking at in a Tox 21? And also, you know, when you come to mixtures, you're going to have a lot of chemistry going on, so you're going to have a statistics-based approach, and how would that be effective in evaluating the human health effects of things like mixtures?
Right. Well, the mixtures question has been a perennial challenge to any approach to toxicology. We haven't yet thought about how evidence-based approaches can be marshaled to tackle that question, but clearly we think there's some potential for how to marshal these approaches for validation of new pathway-based approaches. It's not going to be a panacea, but evidence-based approaches have their quantitative components, but they also have qualitative components, like being transparent, like being systematic. So they're often contrasted with so evidence-based systematic reviews are often contrasted with narrative or so-called expert reviews, where you just get an eminent authority to review the literature, and they make a declaration about something, and they look at some of the data, but not necessarily all of the data. So evidence-based approaches are a way to get around some of that. And so I think there are explicit ground rules that I think will be helpful. I've been on some validation study panels and review boards, and it hasn't been clear why we're only looking at some of the data and not all of the data, for example. So I think there will be some general guidance there, but as to specifically how quantitative approaches can be helpful, I think where the data permit them, I think you'll get a nice unbiased look at where the data wind up. If you can envision a forest plot, for example. That isn't to say there won't be challenges. A lot of this data are not necessarily published in the form of standard scientific articles. A lot of the high throughput data is simply dumped into databases, and so one might have to mine databases rather than systematically go through individual studies. But there are lots of challenges, but we're excited about applying this new discipline to the question of validation.
Yeah, just the quality of tools alone being applied consistently to the data being used in the studies would be very helpful. But I think you have something in mind that'll go beyond that. So I'd like to I didn't look at Suzanne Fitzpatrick's presentation. I think that might be helpful for my question, so I'll look at that.
Right. Well, just to underscore that we're just getting started with this approach. We're discussing the key themes, key issues. We're largely in the conceptual phase. No one has mapped out how we're actually going to do validation with this new approach. We have some thoughts. Richard gave his. There was interesting commentary also in the Q&A session. But we need to pull our thoughts together. We need to come up with common guidance on how to go about appraising that kind of data, for example.
Thank you.
I have a question, Marty.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit about, I think you just touched on this, but it occurs to me that someone who wants to evaluate a new method or several new methods that might be competing in the universe, as it were, may not be able or may not know how to find all the information or data that's available on those methods, because it is more diverse than in an evidence-based medicine example.
Mm-hmm.
So is one of the collaborations planned to provide guidance on how to do one of these reviews, how to find data in various areas, and even how to go about brokering an agreement to look at proprietary data? Is that something that you guys have talked about?
Not so much brokering arrangements to get access to the data. I mean, that's a little deeper into the weeds than we've gotten so far, but definitely the idea is to identify the challenges for doing these kinds of reviews and to see how they can be overcome. So if if the data are primarily in databases, for example, and not in the published literature, or they're in the files of regulatory agencies, these are the sorts of challenges that have to be overcome, and in turn, these are the kinds of challenges that any guidance documents that we and others put together will have to address. Because much of what the, say, Cochrane collaboration does in evidence-based medicine is producing guidance on how to conduct these sorts of reviews. So they have methodological working groups, and we will have the same, because we don't. The idea is that there's a certain consistency, transparency, everything is explicit, and it's not everybody doing their own thing, left to their own devices.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Stevens, for your presentation. Thank you for everyone calling in. And I just wanted to remind you that we do these webinars every other month or so, and we're open to topic suggestions for future webinars. And please visit the website for more information. That website, again, is ascctalks.org. So thanks again, Marty, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.